We're here at the Walker Art Center for a Regis Dialogue with Lawrence Kasdan. We'll be discussing the life and career of this extraordinary filmmaker whose work has time and again explored the rugged terrain of American life, from the frontier towns of the Old West to the suburbs of today's modern cities. As a screenwriter, Kasdan contributed to several of the biggest blockbusters of the 1980s, including Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. But his most distinctive work remains a series of postmodern genre films and sharply observed character dramas that he's directed from his own original screenplays, including the sizzling film noir Body Heat, the boisterous ensemble western Silverado, and his loose trilogy about the aging baby boomer generation, The Big Chill, Grand Canyon, and his latest, Darling Companion. I'm Scott Fondas from the Film Society of Lincoln Center, and we'll now begin our Regis Dialogue with Lawrence Kasdan. It's really such a pleasure to be up here with Larry, who I've always thought is one of the great storytellers in American movies, and I'm hoping he can take us a little bit on his journey tonight through this remarkable career. I thought a logical place to start actually would be to ask you how and when you sort of first got bitten by the movie bug growing up in West Virginia, as you talked a little bit about last night.
Yeah. I grew up in a relatively small town. It wasn't a small town for West Virginia, but it was a small town. And movies always were a magical place for me. And they used to say, you'd call the theater and say, what time's the show? And they'd say, what time can you be here? Because it wasn't a huge audience, but it was a magical place. And they knew, no one in West Virginia knew how films were made or even that they were written. I think they thought that the actors made up the lines and they sort of magically were photographed. And I was one of those. But my brother went off to Harvard and reported back that films were made and written, and that there was actually a career you could have. And I was already in love with the Magnificent Seven. The Great Escape had, electrified me. And in 1962, we were living in Miami Beach briefly, and my brother and I went to see Lawrence of Arabia, and that really changed my life. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to make films. And I was 14 years old, and that never really changed. And that was sort of the goal from that moment on. But
you did sort of have some detours through.
Yes.
Trying to be an academic and then going to work as an advertising copywriter. I mean, did it seem tangible to you that you could have a career in film? Did you know how people went about doing that? Or?
I did. Well, it was actually a good time. When I was in college in the 60s, great many screenwriters were getting to be directors. Yeah. Paul Schrader and Francis Coppola and John Milius. And that was a way to become a director, and I thought for me that was the best way. I had been writing since high school. Mm-hmm. I started writing short fiction and then theater, and went to Michigan because they had the richest collegiate writing contest in the country, which they still do, which is the Hopwood Awards, named for Avery Hopwood, who was a popular playwright of the 30s. And it was very generous. And I was able to win it 4 times, and that was the only way I was able to go through college, because that really supported me and made it possible for me to go to college. So that was very validating to win those awards and to have someone outside of myself and my family say, you can do this.
Yeah. And were there, I'm just thinking, I think a lot of writers sort of start out by sort of trying to imitate writers that they like, that are an influence on them, and then yes. Eventually they find their own voice. I mean, you mentioned some of the films that made a big impression on you, but were there certain writers, either screenwriters or fiction writers, that sort of seduced you with their voice and that you tried to sort of follow in the tradition of?
When I was young,
yeah.
What I consider to be the really important years, which is before I was aware of any of those names, when I was seeing essentially American movies in West Virginia. That was the only thing that was available, current American movies. And you forget that you couldn't see old American movies at anytime you wanted. Whatever came up on the Late Show, if you were lucky, you'd see something. But when I went to Ann Arbor to go to university, suddenly all of world cinema was open to me because it was a fabulous movie center. And there was half a dozen film series running all the time. You could see 1 or 2 movies a night. And for the first time, I now had available to me not only all of the American films that I had missed, the movies from the 30s and 40s and 50s, but all the foreign films that had never come to West Virginia and would never play there. And that was eye-opening and revelatory for me. And suddenly, this conviction I had that this is what I wanted to do was reinforced, tenfold by the fact that what I was seeing was so incredible that it turned out you could do anything in the movies. You could tell any kind of story. There was no subject matter that was out of the reach of the movies. And so that just solidified everything. And you mentioned education, where I got a master's degree in advertising, which is where I got a job. It was 2 different things. And my motives were not pure. I was only focused on becoming a movie director. And the initial idea was, I'll become a high school English teacher and have 3 months a year when I'll be free to write. And when I graduated in 1970, there were no teaching jobs. It was just as hard to become a high school English teacher as to become a movie director. And those jobs had been flooded because everyone was trying to avoid the war.
Yeah.
And, but I did get a master's degree, but it turned out to be sort of useless, except the experience was very useful because I did student teaching in a small town in Michigan, and running a class was a wonderful growing experience, and turned out later to be very applicable to directing movies. Yeah. And then when I couldn't get a job, a friend of my wife ran an advertising agency in Detroit, and he took the initiative, and at a party he said to me, "I hear you write. Do you want to show me some of your stuff? I could maybe use you as a copywriter." And I gave him some of what I had done, and I wrote some advertisements for myself, and he offered me a job at $150 a week, which seemed like a lot, and it was enough for Meg and I to get married.
What was do you remember the first screenplay that you ever wrote?
I do. The other thing that was attractive about the University of Michigan was there was a fabulous playwriting teacher named Kenneth Rowe who taught there, who had been Arthur Miller's teacher. And at one time I got there, Kenneth Rowe was in his 80s. But Arthur Miller had studied with him, and he had done all right after studying with Kenneth Rowe. And he was among many illustrative winners of this Hopwood Award. Oh. And I went there to study with Kenneth Rowe. And the first semester I studied with him, I was writing plays, and some of them were produced there. But he could see that my interest was elsewhere, and he was very generous with me. And I said to him, "Can I start writing screenplays instead of theater?" He said, "Absolutely." And he was a terrific mentor for me, very supportive of the whole idea, never looked down upon screenwriting. And I was able to enter those screenplays in this contest, which put me through school.
So what was it?
Well, the first screenplay was called Just This. And it was the protagonist, I don't know if you should hear all these thought processes, but the protagonist's name was J.T., which had been the name of someone that had made a big impression on me. But and it was about a guy, not unlike me, big surprise, who was at Michigan at this time, which was unbelievably turbulent, stimulating moment. And that's where SDS was formed and where the Weathermen came out of SDS. It was absolutely the heart of what was happening from the late 60s. And this was a screenplay about a guy who is on the edges of that and flirting with that, has a friend deeply involved in that, gets caught up in some violence, and his life is changed. And that was the first screenplay.
So you continued to write screenplays when you were working as an advertising copywriter.
Oh, yeah.
One of those was what would eventually become The Bodyguard,
Yes.
if I'm right. How did you eventually migrate to Los Angeles, and then maybe you can also talk about the role that a couple of young filmmakers of that time, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas,
Yes.
played in the furthering of your career.
Well, I worked in advertising in Detroit for 3 years, and I was very unhappy right from the start, not so much because of anything about advertising as it was not what I wanted to do, and I was very focused on this movie thing, but it did make it possible to start a family, and we had our first son there. And but I would go out to Los Angeles. I started to produce the commercials that I was writing, and I was happy to go to Los Angeles. That was closer to the movies, and we would use the same sound studios and dubbing stages that people were using for the movies. Any brush with feature films, thrilled me and delighted me. And after 3 years, I said to Meg, I have to get out there. We have to get closer to that. We wanted to have another child, but I said, I don't want to bring a second child into the world where I'm in advertising. So I have to be more diligent in that. So we waited, and on one of these trips to make commercials, I got a job with a very good Doyle Dane Bernbach, a good agency that had an office in Los Angeles. And at the same time, I had written The Bodyguard, and I was able to get an agent. It had taken me quite a while to get an agent, but that script did it. And so I moved to LA, but for 2 years I continued to write. I wrote another screenplay that went nowhere, and then a third, which eventually sold. But The Bodyguard kept getting rejected. And my agent, this is pre-computer digital compilation, and when it eventually did sell, he gave me his record of it, and it was on 3x5 cards. That's how high tech it was. And it listed 57 rejections of the screenplay. But at the 58 point, 2 people wanted it at once. So I'd been working for a couple of years in advertising in Los Angeles, and suddenly there was two people interested in this. Not for a lot of money, but they wanted to option it. They offered me so little money that it meant that I would not be able to quit my job. Mm-hmm. So I called up Meg. I said, we have a problem. Here we finally have a sale, but it's not enough to quit advertising. She came down. We walked around the block, and I said, what should I do? They're offering me this. And she said, tell them you have to have a little bit more. And my agent, who had this much faith in me, I called him up and I said, I need to have a little bit more. And he said, oh, that's terrible. You're lucky you've got this. You don't blow it. And I said, no, Meg told me I have to get a little bit more. And he called back in 5 minutes. He said, I said, okay. And the guy who optioned it was John Calley, a legendary studio head. And that afternoon, I walked into my boss and told him that I was leaving advertising. And he said, go. He didn't even make me serve out 2 weeks. And I went out to meet John Calley, who had made Bonnie and Clyde and Clute and All the President's Men.
All those great Warner Brothers movies of that
period. Great movies of that era. And he was a very charismatic, lovely guy, charming, worldly, not from West Virginia. But he couldn't have been nicer to me. And he said, who did you see in this? I said, well, Steve McQueen and Barbra Streisand are sort of the models for it, but I don't expect that to happen. He said, oh, yeah, we'll get them. And I said, really? He said, yeah, no problem. And of course, there was a big problem. But I said, I have nowhere to work. And he said, oh. And he was in this spectacular bungalow at Warner Brothers. And when you walked in the table, he was very casual, with a sweater and jeans, and on his coffee table were magazines this thick for yachts and classic cars. And that was sort of the world that I was seeing. I was sort of gaga. And he said, no problem. But I said, I have nowhere to work. And he said, oh, well, my next door here in the other half of this bungalow is Robert Towne's office. Now, Robert Towne is still one of the greatest screenwriters that ever lived. Wrote Chinatown and The Last Detail and Shampoo, and it was a hero of mine. And I said, yeah. He said, well, but he never comes in, so you can use his office. And I said, well, okay, if you think so. And he said, yeah, let's go look at it. And we went in there, and this entire bungalow had once been one thing and had been divided into two, one side for Callie and one side for Robert Towne. But when it was one bungalow, it was Jack Warner's bungalow. Oh, wow. And so you went through the office, and I saw here's Towne's desk and pictures of Towne's exotic giant dogs, which I loved, yeah. And no sign of Towne. And you went into the bathroom, and the bathroom was about the size of the stage, and it was all tiled, and there was a bathtub there. They must have had half the Warner Brothers star take baths together. I don't know. It was quite large. But the best feature was this mirror, a big mirror. But it wasn't a regular mirror. It was a golden mirror. When you looked into it, you looked tan, you looked successful. And I was so happy, and I thought I had never looked better myself. And I was able to, and I moved in there, and Bob Towne was working out at the beach, never complained. I did run into him a couple times. He was very gracious with me, and we've remained friendly over the years. And I did a rewrite of The Bodyguard in Robert Towne's office at Robert Towne's desk, and none of those rewrites really were as good as Robert Towne's work, but the movie just kept going.
And then getting
never
made
got
25
made.
years later.
It took years and years for it to get made, and it went through many versions, and my brother did versions of it, and we did a version that would have starred Whoopi Goldberg, and Marcia Norman did it, who had won a Pulitzer Prize, did a version, just version after version. But years later, when I was making Silverado, and I was using a young actor, Kevin Costner, who really was just beginning at that time. And he said to me, I've read The Bodyguard, and I want to be in The Bodyguard. I want to be The Bodyguard. And I said, well, that's no problem at all. All you have to do is become a gigantic movie star. And he said, all right, I'll do that. And he did. He became a gigantic movie star. And so in 1991, about 14 years after it was first optioned, the film was made. I was already directing, and Meg and I had written Grand Canyon. And right at this moment, they asked me to direct The Bodyguard, and I said, no, I don't want to do it. The true reason was there were plot problems with it that I could not solve, but I didn't say that. I said, I want to work with Meg on this Grand Canyon. So I produced that with Kevin Costner and Jim Wilson, and the movie was successful beyond my wildest dreams. I did not expect that, and of course it had the whole story of Whitney and the tragedy eventually that led to.
So how did you come in the span of about a year to write both The Empire Strikes Back and Raiders of the Lost Ark?
That was so I was in advertising, and then I optioned this thing, and John Calley, I said, John Calley, I have another script. I'm almost done. And he said, well, great. I'm your best hope here. Give it to me as soon as you. And that was a script called Continental Divide. And I gave it to him, and I couldn't wait. This was going to be my second sale in a matter of months after 7 years of trying. And he called me up at home on a Sunday. I'd given it to him on a Friday, and he said, Larry, I'm sorry, I just don't like this. And my world sort of crashed down, and at that moment, Meg, her parents were visiting from Detroit, and she walked in from the grocery store, and she had adopted a dog on the spur of the moment. And this poor dog was forever branded by John Calley's rejection of my screenplay. And I tried to love him and did the best I could, but there was always a cloud over that dog. But after Calley rejected it that Sunday, the next week, everybody started bidding on it, including Steven Spielberg. And so I was trying to eke out enough money to stay out of advertising and have a career. And suddenly the movie was very much in demand, sold for a lot of money. And they said, Steven wants to meet you. And I went out to Universal, where he was sponsoring, mentoring Bob Zemeckis in his first film, which was I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's a very funny movie about Beatlemania, about some kids who go into New York to see the Beatles and brush up against them. It's a very funny movie, which I recommend. But I had never met Steven Spielberg. Had never met anybody. And I was taken out to the back lot, and there was Steven sitting on this fake curb on a fake street, and he said, sit down. And I said, hi, and he said, I love Continental Divide, we'll get it made. I'm not going to make it, but I'm going to get somebody else to make it. He said, but I want to talk to you because George Lucas and I are going to do an adventure film. And there's very few details of it yet, but I showed him Continental Divide, and we think you're the right person to do it. And I said, oh, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, I would consider that. And George had just made Star Wars, and Steven had made Jaws and Close Encounters. Those were the three previous films from these two. And George had made American Graffiti, one of my favorite movies to this day. So I said, okay. And he said, but I want to warn you about one thing, which is when you go in there, George is going to try to get you to write the sequel to American Graffiti, and I want you to say no. I said, okay, I'll say no to George Lucas. I won't take his job. But as it happened, the meeting was arranged. We walked in, we talked, and George Lucas said, oh, we want to do this adventure movie. It's like the old serials, and it's going to be, the hero will be named for my dog, Indiana. And the guy's going to have a whip and a hat. It's going to be really cool. And and Phil Kaufman, when he was 11 years old, Phil Kaufman, the great director of The Right Stuff, had come up with the MacGuffin, which is what everything in a movie is when you're chasing after. And his orthodontist had told Phil Kaufman in Chicago when he was 11 years old about the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And at one time, Phil Kaufman was going to direct this movie that they had in mind, but then he just bowed out of it. But they kept the idea of the Lost Ark of the Covenant, and they said, we were going to want you to go talk to Phil Kaufman, which I eventually did. But at this meeting, he said, that's all we know. Whip, dog name, Lost Ark of the Covenant. And I said, sounds great. And George did something I've never seen him do since, and I've known him now for 30 years, is he said, well, maybe this is a historic moment. And he stood up and came out from around his desk. He said, let's all shake hands. And Frank Marshall was there, who had never worked with either of them, but Steven wanted to produce this movie. And we had all just met going into this meeting. And we all shook hands. It was very formal and unlike George, and a lovely moment, actually. And we shook hands, and then George and Steven looked at Frank and I and said, get lost. And we basically walked out. And we were walking across the lot, and Frank said to me, did we just get that job? And I said, I don't know, but maybe when we get home, if they've called our agents, then we're good. And when we got home, they had called our agents. So that's how I came to work with George Lucas.
And and can you just talk a little bit about, because it seems like it was such a bare bones pitch.
Yes.
So, how did this, one of the most iconic characters now in American movies, Indiana Jones, how did he materialize in your mind? Who was he in your mind?
As I say, they knew that the kind of movie they wanted to make, and they had been inspired by these serials. In fact, I was not so much interested in those serials, which are funny and funky, and if you can see them, and they're sort of, they don't have that much connection to Raiders of the Lost Ark. What I was inspired by was the adventure films that had excited me since I was a kid, which were the films of Howard Hawks and Raoul Walsh and John Ford and all these big Hollywood productions and King Solomon's Mines and they said, we want to do something in the spirit of those movies. But the first thing that happened was they said that George and Steven and I were going to go to a house in the hills in San Fernando Valley for a week and talk it through. because they didn't know where it was going to go or what the details were. And we did do that. We sat down, and it was very heady stuff for me since I'd been in advertising about 2 minutes earlier. And but we sat there and we concocted Raiders of the Lost Ark.
And on Empire Strikes Back, because it was the second film after Star Wars, how much leeway did you have in terms of what you could do with the characters, what you could do with the story? How much of a roadmap was there, and was there a moment in which, you know, George came in and whispered in your ear, by the way, you know, Darth Vader is Luke's father? I mean, how did that happen exactly?
That was big news. What happened is I went away and I wrote Raiders of the Lost Ark for 6 months. And I came, and it was there was no electronic screenplays or anything, and I thought, as a formal, I could have sent it to him, but I decided to take it up to San Rafael. I was living in Los Angeles, and George was headquartered in San Rafael, and I took the finished screenplay up of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And we walked into his office, and he took it, he threw it on his desk. He said, let's go out to lunch. And we went out to lunch, and he said, I'm in big trouble. Lee Brackett, the great screenwriter, been working since the 40s.
With Hawks.
With Hawks, exactly. Worked on Big Sleep, and a great woman who had also written science fiction. He had hired her to write a first draft of The Empire Strikes Back, and unfortunately Lee had died right at that moment. She was in her 80s. And he said, I'm building sets in England, and I don't have a screenplay. I don't have anything close to a screenplay. I want you to write the sequel to Star Wars. And I said, well, don't you want to read Raiders of the Lost Ark? And he said, oh yeah, I'm going to read it tonight, and if I don't like it, I'm going to call you up tomorrow, I'm going to take back this offer. But he did like it, and we went forward very quickly. In about 6 weeks, wrote Empire. And Irvin Kershner was the director, had already been designated. Now, Irvin was a fabulous guy and a very interesting director who had never done anything like Star Wars. He'd done The Eyes of Laura Mars and Loving, very gritty New York movies. He was a gritty, very rabbinical kind of guy, fabulously intelligent, learned, and you never knew what he was going to say about anything. Couldn't have been an odder choice for a sequel to Star Wars. Turned out to be a brilliant choice for it, and probably made the best Star Wars movie. And in 6 weeks, Irvin and George and I hammered out the script to Empire, and there was a moment when George said, Darth Vader is Luke's father. And I said, no shit. I thought that was wonderful. That was fabulous, because clearly what had been interesting in the first one was now going to become much more interesting. And George barely could get Star Wars made. It was made for $10 million, and no one wanted to do it, and people had projected that it would be a big flop. He had no idea that he would ever get to make a sequel to it. But when it became the biggest movie in history, suddenly and he's a very directed guy, and this is sort of what he thought. He thought it was going to be a hugely successful Star Wars, and he was all ready to go with the second act of what he saw as a 3-act play, which would end with the Return of the Jedi. And so he knew all this stuff about the story, and on that, unlike Raiders, where we had come up with everything together, I very much felt I was simply there to help him, facilitate him. They were building, as he said, huge sets in London, and they didn't know what was going to happen in the sets. And so they were very receptive to the work I did. So.
Well, of course, all of this sort of set the stage for you to be able to make your own directorial debut with Body Heat, which I think I'm not alone in thinking to be, along with Chinatown, sort of the great modern film noir. Not that there's enough of them. And this is a story of a sort of shyster lawyer in Florida, in small-town Florida, who falls under the spell of a very beautiful femme fatale who entreats him to help her murder her husband, and with many, many complications. So we're going to take a look at a scene, and this is not I first thought to show the first scene where these characters meet, which is a great scene, and then I thought maybe that was a little too predictable. So this is actually the second scene where they meet after William Hurt's character Ned has sort of been searching high and low for Kathleen Turner's character Maddie, and then happens upon her in this watering hole.
What are you doing in Pine Haven?
I'm no yokel. I was all the way to Miami once.
There are some men, once they get a whiff of it, they trail you like a hound.
I met that Eager.
What's your name, anyway?
Ned Racine.
Maddie Walker.
Wow. You all right?
Yes, I'm fine. My temperature runs a couple of degrees high, around 100. I don't mind. It's the engine or something.
Maybe you need a tune-up.
Don't tell me. You have just the right tool.
I don't talk like that.
I love the dialogue in that scene, and I kind of allude to it in the program notes of this series, but I really think a movie like Pulp Fiction doesn't exist without Body Heat coming 15 years before, because of this kind of idea of doing a postmodern genre film. I mean, the people in this movie sort of talk like the characters in the old film noirs, but the setting is modern and very realistic, and somehow it all works. It's not a parody exactly, but it's a movie that's sort of aware of itself in an interesting
Yes,
way.
absolutely. Bruce Springsteen did a wonderful keynote. I think I mentioned to you that at South by Southwest about a month ago, and at one point he's talking about his history, what music meant a lot to him, and he breaks down all the lyrics in the Animals song, "We Gotta Get Out of This Place," and having him break it down slowly, you hear it really anew, and you know, about his father working, and the girl he's in love with is going to have a short life because of the conditions they're in, and they have to get out of there. And at the end, as he's sort of deconstructed the song, he says, "That's every song I've ever written," and I thought that was very honest of him, and I'm a big Springsteen fan, and absolutely true, that all the elements of his work is in that. Well, that's how I feel about Double Indemnity and Out of the Past. These Body Heat couldn't exist without those movies. They electrified me. I loved the way the people talked in them. I loved how duplicitous the characters were. I loved how wised up the sensibility was, and I tried to put that into Body Heat, and I ripped it off, those movies off, you know, just shamelessly, and but it was great fun. It was great fun coming up with my version of it. I'm a big Pulp Fiction fan, so I love The Illusion.
Me too, yeah.
It's a child of that genre. I was interested in the kind of character that Bill Hurt plays, which is a guy who's sort of drifted through life and slipped and been very charming with people, but is not very smart. And he is looking for that main chance, looking for the quick score, that he can suddenly jump ahead. He's barely scraping by as a mediocre lawyer in this little town. When he meets her, he doesn't know that she's already chosen him from out of the pack, and that she's going to offer him exactly that kind of opportunity. And he just doesn't know how much has gone on ahead of him and how much is going on in her mind, and her mind encompasses his. But the main character was someone that I recognized as among my friends, and they couldn't believe that now out of college, when we had seemed very potent and effective as 60s college students, that in the world they were finding it very difficult to make their way. And some of them were looking for the shortcut. And that's really at the heart of this movie, because that's what his problem is, among others. But he's looking for the quick score. And in fact, her husband, who he meets later, sees right through that and measures William Hurt very effectively.
That's a delightful scene also in that restaurant, which we could easily have shown. But this was really the first big movie for Bill Hurt and Kathleen Turner. In fact, I think it is the first movie for her, isn't it?
For Kathleen, it was. Bill had already done Altered States, and when I met him, he was shooting Eyewitness of Peter Yates, from a great director, Peter Yates. And they were shooting Eyewitness with Sigourney Weaver in New York City, and when I met him, he was in the middle of shooting that. So he had two pictures coming out. I think Altered States maybe had just opened. And he's a fascinating guy. We wound up doing 4 movies together, and he's quite a handful in every way. He's very smart, and he talks a lot. And when we first met, he came to see me in this hotel suite. My producer was there, a guy the studio had assigned to me, a very tough guy, wonderful guy who had been the first AD on The Godfather and was now producing Body Heat. And we talked, and Bill and I both drank a lot, and we continued to talk. And finally, my producer, a guy named Fred
Fuchs?
Fred Gallo.
Fred Gallo.
Yeah, a wonderful, really tough guy. Gets up, he was drinking too, but he went to his room, and he called me. And he said, "Do you want me to throw him out?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He's unbearable. How can you stand talking to him?" I said, no, give us some more time. Fred came back. And so I thought I had met a kindred spirit who really understood this movie, because Fred thought he was just a pain in the ass. And the next day, his agent called and said, "Bill really wants to be in this movie, but he wants you to get rid of the murder." So that was a decision moment for me, which is, we said, "Are you out of your mind? It's impossible. This is what this movie is about." And they called back and they said, "Well, he'll do it anyway."
Well, I think actually we'll see more of Bill Hurt later on in some other clips. And looking back at these films, I also happened to see Broadcast News again recently. I mean, I think at that moment he was really just about the most exciting thing going on in American movies. He was, probably the most electrifying
He was.
actor
He had already won.
post Nicholson.
Yes, he won an Academy Award for Kiss of the Spider Woman in both in this movie and in Broadcast News, where again he plays a character who's not that smart, but is very charming, and women are drawn to. He's unrecognizable from the guy he played for me in The Accidental Tourist, who's the opposite of that, and very held in and very intelligent. Bill made decisions about his career that were very purposeful. There's nothing accidental about it. He had the regular route of stardom was not only open, he was on it, and he resisted it in every way. He did not want to use his looks. He did not want to be the kind of movie star that he disdained. He wanted to be a character actor, and that's what he became. And for a long time, he was playing leading roles, and he did for me quite a bit. But the choices he made were purposeful, and he has made his life the way he wanted it.
Well, this idea that you were talking about before about a guy who's kind of slipped, who hasn't lived up to his sort of own envisioning of what he should have been and that kind of thing, this is an idea that you got to explore in a different setting and at greater length with more characters in your next movie, which is, of course, The Big Chill. I'm curious if at any point when you were making that film, you had any sense of the sort of cultural event that it was going to be. I mean, really a kind of a touchstone movie that I think a lot of people saw themselves in a very unique way, which is to say people would identify with a certain character, and they saw themselves in particular characters when they saw that film.
Yeah, I had no sense of that. None of us did. When Body Heat came out, it was very well received, and a lot of people wanted to make movies with me. And the movie I wanted to make was The Big Chill, and it had all these characters in it because I wanted to work with a lot of actors. I didn't want to do another movie like Body Heat. And I took the movie around, and all these studio heads who wanted to be in business with me said, "No, we don't understand this movie at all. There are 7 leads. Who are we supposed to care about? What kind of movie is that? And also, what is it talking about? It's, we don't understand." And most of these studio heads were a generation older than me. And I said, "Well, this seems like true stuff to me, and it's meaningful to me," and that wasn't that convincing to them. And it was only through the good offices of a magnificent woman named Marcia Nassiter, who for a moment worked for Johnny Carson, and for that one moment they had a put picture, which is that if you said they wanted, at a certain price, the studio had to make the picture. And she said, "We're going to use our put picture, the Johnny Carson Company, to make this movie." And there were some other people competing for that slot, but she said, "No, this is it." And Marcia was an old lefty, and she identified with the issues in the movie. And she got that movie made, and it was made for $8 million at Columbia, and that was the limit on what this put picture could cost. They didn't want to do it, and Frank Price, who was running the studio at that time, I remember the first time he saw the movie, we ran it for him at the studio, and he stood up when it was over. He didn't say a word to me, walked out. And we later had a preview that went spectacularly well in the house in Seattle, which has been a great town for me. And the people were laughing the whole time, and there was raucous. It was your dream preview. And Frank Price came out at the end, and he said to me, "I didn't realize this was a comedy." And I think that was at the heart of the thing. And it's no offense to Frank. It was just, I think it spoke in a language that he didn't understand. And it was spoke about issues that were not issues for him. And I don't think we thought that it would connect with as big an audience as it did. And the first night was okay, the box office. And then the second night we were having dinner with our producer. And he was late showing up, and Meg and I had spent that day walking around saying, well, you know, what was the chances that this is going to connect with anyone? Because it's really about Michigan, going to Michigan, and what happened to our friends, you know, 10 years later. And our producer walked in and he said, you're not going to believe this. There's a line around the block at the Avco in Westwood. And that was the beginning of the movie, just playing and playing and playing. And people connected to it who were not that age, who were older, who were younger. And that was a total surprise. I wish I could have foreseen that, but I don't have any no knowledge like that. So I was very happy that people connected to it.
Well, we're going to take a look at a scene from The Big Chill, and I mean, for the one or two people out there who, you know, haven't seen the movie, I guess we should say it's a movie about a reunion of old college friends because one of their friends has killed himself. And sort of on the second day after the funeral, all of the significant others and everyone has left, and it's just the friends, and they have a dinner together in which, in a way, if somebody wanted to know what the movie was about, I think what Glenn Close has to say in the scene is what the movie's about. So take a look at The Big Chill.
I don't know, I'd hate to think that it was all just fashion.
What?
Our commitment.
It wasn't. We accomplished things. All evidence to the contrary.
Now you're just taking a position.
Sometimes I think I've put that time down, pretended it wasn't real, just so I can live with how I am now. You know what I mean?
Nick, help me with these bleeding hearts.
I know what Alex would say.
What?
What's for dessert? I'm not cynical about dessert.
Want to load the dishwasher?
I'd be thrilled.
Great.
I know you wanna leave me, but I refuse to let you go. If I have to beg, plead for your sympathy, I don't mind, 'cause you mean that much to me. Ain't you proud to beg, and you know it. Yeah. Please don't leave me, girl.
I love the way that scene turns from something very melancholy to this dance number. And I wanted to let it play through that part because also, obviously, one of the things that was so special about this film was the soundtrack, which sort of became as popular as the film. And I think it really was the first time that popular music was used quite in this way in a film. I think, you know, Mean Streets was one sort of breakthrough.
And American Graffiti had done a great job with that. I mean, I was ripping off great people, but
in a way, but the fact that so much of the music in this movie is actually source music, and it's integrated into the scenes. It's not just soundtrack music. The characters are interacting with it, like the way that the funeral turns into, you know, you have the organist playing You Can't Always Get What You Want, and then that comes on the soundtrack. So can you talk a little bit about conceiving of the soundtrack of the film, and that it would be these songs and that it would be used in this way to sort of tell the story?
Right from the beginning, I thought, and Barbara Benedict agreed, and Meg, my wife, who was very involved with this whole thing, we knew we wanted to use the songs that had meant a lot to us when we were at Michigan, which is in the 60s. And there was a treasure trove. There were hundreds of songs that meant a lot to us. It was the greatest time for music. And I asked Meg to start compiling all those songs, and from the hundreds of songs on many, many tapes, we started cutting them down and choosing and winnowing. And Carol Littleton, who was my editor for the second time here, and eventually we've done 9 movies together, was trying different things. Some of the songs were designated, as you say. You can't always get you what you want. It was written into the script, and that is what JoBeth Williams plays as they exit the funeral. And Meg had come up with the idea of Heard It Through the Grapevine for the opening sequence when they're all finding out that Alex has killed himself. And there was never a moment when the music wasn't the movie. It was all part and parcel. And sometimes it was difficult to choose among great songs, and because a lot of things fit. A lot of things were a perfect soundtrack for this story. That soundtrack would not be possible today on most movies because the prices have skyrocketed. As the music business has been hurt and taken a dive, the cost of licensing has skyrocketed. And in Darling Companion, where we had no money, we were really dependent on the kindness of strangers, and Bonnie Raitt let us use the song for a very reasonable price. She said she liked the movie, she liked me, and that was thrilled because we could never afford even the one Bonnie Raitt song. But back then we were using all these incredible hits, and we were able to do it for a very limited amount of money.
So what you're basically saying, you ruined it for everyone else.
Well, it became it did become popular. So those songs, that while we were making the movie, cutting the movie, there was that sort of infusion of energy at all times. And we shot the funeral very early, and when JoBeth sat down, and she does play the organ, and she started playing I Can't Always Get What You Want, that was the one moment I thought, oh, this could be really cool. This movie could be really cool. And everyone in the audience, all the friends recognized the song immediately. Funny thing happened to Meg and I years later. We were going out to dinner with a couple that we didn't know very well, and they were talking about The Big Chill, and the wife said, there was a song in Big Chill that I really wanted to play at our wedding, but my husband didn't want to use it. And I said, what was that? She said, you can't always get what you want. And she said, I still regret it.
So you talked sort of about the difficulty of convincing the studios to make this movie.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was confusing to them. Here's the guy who wrote Raiders of the Lost Ark and Empire Strikes Back, and then he made this film noir, and now he wants to make this kind of movie. And then next you wanted to make a Western.
Yeah.
And at a time when nobody, not even Clint Eastwood, was making Westerns. Yes. And talk a little bit. I mean, to me, Silverado, as I told you the other night, it's a movie I saw when it was new and I was a kid, and I think I loved it in the way that you loved these Howard Hawks and Raoul Walsh movies that you saw when you were a kid. And I don't think I'd ever seen a Western when I saw that movie because it had been this big dry spell. How did that come about, and how easy was it to convince people to make that picture?
Well, The Big Chill was such a hit that was a moment when you could do almost anything, and I knew that moment would not last long, and that I should use it to make a Western, which I had always loved Westerns. They had been enormously impactful for me, Red River and Magnificent Seven, and on and on and on. So at that point, the studios were very receptive to whatever I wanted to do, because The Big Chill had been a big success when no one thought it would be, which is the best kind of success. And so they said, whatever you want to do. And my brother and I, who had played cowboys in the hills in West Virginia, where we grew up, and he shared my enthusiasm for it. I said, Mark, let's sit down and write a Western. And we just did. And we put in all the stuff we liked about Westerns. And we put wonderful people in it and had a great score by Bruce Broughton. We shot in New Mexico, a place I've shot again later, and it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. The light is incredible. John Bailey, we shot it in Super 35, which gives you an infinite depth of field. It's not used anymore, but not too much. But it let us shoot this incredible landscape and see the foreground figures in focus too. That was not something you saw too much. And it was just fun.
And it's a kind of an unusual Western because it's an ensemble film. I mean, it's sort of like the Big Chill of Westerns in a way.
It is.
And it has some very sort of counterintuitive casting choices, like John Cleese playing sheriff of a small frontier town. So in a way, it kind of harkens back to, I think, what we were talking about with Body Heat, of doing kind of self-aware genre movie. I mean, did you think of it as being
we thought,
to the
what is it
Western
that
what Body Heat was to film noir?
Yes, in the sense that we thought, what is it that we like about Westerns? What do we want to shoot? What would be the most fun to do? What kind of characters do we like? And it's true, most Westerns are about one guy, really, and his journey across the landscape. And this is a Western about an ensemble, as you say. But the story is actually, for me, the story of filmmaking, which is that you meet a bunch of strangers, you recognize each other's talents and skills, and then you embark upon a journey. And that's what happens in Silverado. So for me, it was I was so absolutely delighted that I was making movies now, and this is all I'd ever wanted to do, and I was doing it, anything I wanted to do, which was amazing, and I'm not as amazing as it is now, but so here I'm going out to make this great Western, and it's a mirror of the filmmaking process, which I was completely entranced with and still am. And so you can look at it as the adventure of filmmaking. And a bunch of people come together, they face enormous adversity, and they finally get to the promised land.
I want to talk a little bit now about The Accidental Tourist, which we're going to look at in a second. And this is another departure in a way because it was an adaptation of an Ann Tyler novel. Maybe you can actually talk a little bit about that process, the process of adaptation versus doing an original screenplay, and what challenges there were for you in that, if any, and what you enjoyed about that process.
I had been working on another picture that was a brilliant screenwriter named Carol Eastman, who had written 5 Easy Pieces. And then she was a very unusual person, and she had a lot of trouble adapting. She was a real artist, and she had a lot of trouble adapting to life in Hollywood. She wrote The Fortune, which was a big disaster for Mike Nichols and Warren Beatty, and that set her back quite a bit. But she had written a movie about a crazy male dog trainer that she had written for Jack Nicholson, who was a friend of hers from 5 Easy Pieces, who meets a very straight-laced woman who has a dog that she can't control. And I was working on that for quite a while, and none of the timing was working out, and we were going to do it with Robert De Niro and Jessica Lange, and then David Geffen, who actually owned the project, said, "This is too hard, I don't think we should do this." And he backed out. At that very moment, John Malkovich and his manager sent me The Accidental Tourist. There was a screenplay already by a wonderful writer named Frank Galati, and who is, been instrumental in much of Steppenwolf's work. He's a terrific theater director and a very good writer. And the book, which is what I started with, was Ann Tyler's book, was magnificent. And she's a great writer, and I loved this book. And I thought that the screenplay had not really captured what was wonderful about the book. And it would be a challenge to answer your question about adaptation, which is a great book is 5 times the size of any movie, even a book that is not terribly long, which The Accidental Tourist is not terribly long. But there's so much incident in any good novel, and a movie is boiled down, no matter how dense it may seem. In fact, there are very few scenes in a movie, and you have to do everything very economically. So the challenge, it seemed to me, to take this wonderful novel and make it a movie was to know what to take out, what to leave, and how do you maintain the essence of what you love about the book, and still have it fit, not just in time, but in momentum, in the way people receive movies, which is there's a limit on how much incident you can have before it becomes distracting. There are so many paths you can follow and before you suddenly lose the path, So it's a question of condensing it and finding what you love about it and finding a filmic equivalent for it. And a lot of times you change the scene entirely. Sometimes a look takes the place of 2 or 3 scenes that are in the novel. That's what you're hoping, that the actors have brought something to it and done some of the work. Well, when I read that novel, I thought, oh, there's a great movie in here. And there was skepticism in Hollywood about that, although, paradoxically, Warner Brothers wanted to make that movie. Now, today, that would be impossible. But in 1987, when they approached me about it, they wanted to make that movie. They wanted to use Chevy Chase, but other than that, we saw it pretty much the same. And I did a draft of the movie, and I said, I think this is perfect for Bill Hurt. And Kathleen came on to play his wife, who he separated from. And we saw a lot of people for Muriel and Geeta Davis, who I knew. Just her test was spectacular, and we put her in the movie.
Well, ironically, this is another movie where one of the main characters is a dog trainer.
Yes.
So you sort of went from
it was reversed.
one dog trainer,
a crazy woman dog trainer, and a straight-laced man.
A man who's recovering from the tragic death of his young son, and a man who's a kind of strange travel writer, a man who writes books for people who don't like to travel guides for people who actually, I think, like a lot of American tourists, actually want to go around the world and eat the same food that they eat when they're at home and have all the, they don't like small hotels. You go on the internet with people say, I can't believe the hotel rooms are so small in Europe. So this guy is writing books for those
He writes
kind
guides
of people.
for people who don't want to know they've left home.
Exactly.
But have to leave home. And he gives them the absolute essentials they need in their luggage so they can keep that to a minimum. He gives them American restaurants in every city where they can go and avoid the local cuisine. He is really about control. And what the real story was about, in my mind, was that this tragedy of losing his son in a random act of violence has so overwhelmed him, broken up his marriage. He is absolutely suffocating in grief, and he cannot control it. And it happens that when his marriage breaks up, he gets custody of the dog. They had a corgi, and the dog has become suddenly uncontrollable, is biting people, and he doesn't know what to do about it. But in my mind, it was clearly that the dog represented this grief that he could not control, but he does not realize that. He doesn't have any sense of that, and he stumbles upon this dog trainer, and she is immediately interested in him more than the dog, but she also has enormous affinity for the dog and is able to control the dog and, in fact, tames his grief over the course of the story. And he begins life anew with this crazy dog trainer.
So this is The Accidental Tourist.
My speciality is dogs that bite.
Specialty. Webster prefers specialty. That must be a dangerous job.
Not for me. I can handle anything. Biters, barkers, dogs that haven't been treated right.
Hello, Edward.
Even split personality.
Split personality?
Where your dog is like nice to you but kills all others.
Come on, Edward.
Not that Edward would bite me, of course. He just fell in love with me, like I think I was telling you.
Well, I'm glad to hear it.
But I could train him in no time not to bite other people. You think about it and give me a call, Muriel. Remember? Muriel Pritchett.
Of course, Geena Davis won an Academy Award for that wonderful performance. I think it really launched her career. You were talking before about doing 4 pictures with Bill Hurt. You've done 6 with Kevin Kline, which I realized is one more than Howard Hawks did with Cary Grant. And you've also worked repeatedly with the same crew. You mentioned before Carol Littleton and, of course, the great Owen Roizman, who shot most of your films, and James Newton Howard doing the soundtracks. Was that a sort of goal of yours to create a kind of family that would sort of travel with you from picture to picture?
Absolutely. It's hard work that is full of surprises. It's great work, but it's grueling. And things never go the way you think they're going to go. And so if you can fill up the crew and the cast with people that you know and trust and who you're happy to see very early in the morning, that makes it much more attractive. And when you find someone you love and trust, as I do, Carol Littleton, who, right from Body Heat, I thought had immaculate taste and was a perfect complement to what I was thinking, and disagreed with me in all the right places and would argue with me, and we would negotiate. You want to work with them again, and I had John Bailey, her husband, shot 3 of my movies, and Owen Roizman shot 4 of them or so, I think, and you love working with people that you can trust. My AD staff basically never changed, and it's a great privilege to get to see those people again and meet them in these, as mentioned with Silverado, in circumstances that are often very challenging. And you have this group, this family, this people that you respect, who have spent their whole life getting good at what they do, and that's what I find very invigorating about filmmaking. The whole aspect of a group effort in pressurized circumstances.
I'm going to get to Grand Canyon in a minute, but I don't want to skip over a movie I haven't seen in years, but that I remember really liking at the time, which is this rather zany comedy that not many people saw called I Love You to Death.
Yes.
Again with Kevin Kline, in what I believe is a true story, or at least a fact-based story of a pizzeria owner whose wife dispatched some very incompetent hitmen to knock him off unsuccessfully. And a movie with an incredible cast, Tracy Ullman, Joan Plowright, River Phoenix. How did you discover this strange tale and decide that there was a movie there?
And this script was written by John Kosmeyer, who was a playwright, first and foremost, and had written this screenplay based on a true story that happened in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I think. And the pizza owner was cheating on his wife serially and could not help himself and didn't have all that much guilt about it. And finally, she got so sick of it, she tried to kill him very incompetently. As you say, she hires 2 junkies to do it, and they botch the job horribly. And I just loved it. I thought it was funny. And I was able to get that amazing, everybody you mentioned, plus Keanu Reeves,
yeah,
and a bunch of supporting players who I used repeatedly in movies. And Owen Roizman shot it, and we shot in Tacoma, which is a funky, interesting town. And it was just a really satisfying experience. And of course, no one went to see it. And there is a scene in it that I'm sure you didn't pick, because people don't very often show clips from I Love You to Death. But where Kevin has been shot,
Yeah.
By Bill Hurt, and Keanu Reeves have barely been able to get a bullet into him. And they're all downstairs, all the conspirators, River Phoenix and Joan Plowright, who's an absolute treasure, and Tracy Ullman. And Kevin walks downstairs, and he says that he's heard a loud sound and something woke him up. And he doesn't realize, as we see when he turns around, that there's a bullet hole in the middle of his back, and his blood is spreading terribly. But it hasn't been fatal, and he barely aware of what's going on, and he asks his wife if she's offered cheese and crackers to the visitors. And I recommend it. I don't often recommend my own stuff, but for that one scene, it's worth the checking out. I Love You to Death.
Well, you mentioned earlier that one of the reasons, or your cover story for not directing The Bodyguard, was because you had started to work on Grand Canyon, which you wrote with Meg, and you were both nominated for the Oscar for that script. As a longtime Los Angeles resident, I really think of it as one of the movies that sort of best captures the feel of Los Angeles, especially Los Angeles in the Rodney King era. It's another sprawling ensemble film with a lot of stories. It kind of also anticipates something like Robert Altman's Shortcuts. It was a tough way to pick a scene from this movie because there's so many stories, and I think there's actually really a lot of great scenes. But I found that looking at these films, I was constantly drawn back to scenes of people either meeting for the first time or the second time. Wonderful exchanges between 2 people, and this is actually this is a movie that opens with Kevin Kline, who plays an immigration lawyer, nearly getting carjacked when his car breaks down in a bad part of town, and he's rescued by a tow truck driver played by Danny Glover. And he goes back to see him then, sort of thank him for saving his life, and that's what we're going to take a look at, and then I want to ask you a little bit more about how this movie came about.
All right.
My father died last year. 81 years old. It's a long time for a black man to live in this town. He outlived everyone he ever knew. Saw 2 wives die and 3 of his children. He had a great ugly old face that looked like a suitcase going 1,000,000 miles, all beat up and dented and scuffed and stained. Man, he looked like he walked 80 years on that face. Well, I used to look at that face and see all the pain there, all the things he lost, all the hurt he had. I wonder why he wanted to go on, why he just didn't lay down and give it up.
Did you figure it out?
No, I never figured out much about that guy. I asked him, though.
What did he say?
Habit.
He had a great ugly old face that looked like it'd gone 1,000,000 miles. You know, when you hear a line like that, if you're trying to write, you know, you just want to throw in the towels. You know, it's very hard. It's hard, a high standard you set for the rest of us. Where did this movie come from? What were you and Meg thinking about talking about when you started working on this?
Yeah. We had raised 2 sons in Los Angeles. We had been living there at this point about 15 years. And it seemed that things weren't going well in the city. I had been at a Laker game with a friend and my younger son, and we were driving home, and some people started following us, and I was worried, and I felt all the things you feel, you know, and we'd make turns and they'd follow us, and I had taken a shortcut to get home from the Forum, and it was probably not the best way to go, but that very thought enraged me, that if you made the wrong turn, that suddenly you're in a hostile territory. And the same would be true for people coming into my neighborhood. The city, which was supposed to, ideally, be a gathering place for all kinds of people, and where there would be free transit among the neighborhoods, had become this these different camps where you had to be very careful what turn you made, and it made me really angry. And I thought, what kind of place is this that we've created, and what kind of place are my kids growing up in, and what are these different people like? Is there any ground on which they can meet? Is there common ground that you hope for in an ideal society? And what happens if you just threw people together by accident? And how do you describe chance meetings like that, which become lifelong friendships? Well, in fact, everyone we know starts out that way, as some strangers. It can be your wife or your companion, your your boss, someone you work with. But there's always that moment when you meet them for the first time, and you have no idea. You have no idea that they're going to stick, because like most people, they could just flow by like in a river and you never see them again. But some people do stick, and they become an important part of your life. And you don't have, if you went to a different school, or you went to a different party, or you didn't go out for a certain team, you would never have met them. And your life would have taken another shape. You would have met other people, and that's all going on all the time. So I was interested in that. So in the setting of this big, thriving city, I was interested in those chance meetings, what those relationships can be like. Is there any kind of pattern to it? How do you make any sense of it? And of course, because I can't make anything up, I worked in that building on the Miracle Mile.
Oh, wow.
And one morning I was going to work. I was working for Doyle Dane Bernbach, the advertising agency, and I almost got splattered on the front of a bus, and a woman in a pirate's cap did grab me. And she pulled me back, and it's happened to almost everyone, that someone just reaches out and warns you or saves you. And I was haunted by that moment. And I felt that what had happened between the Dana Glover character and the Kevin Kline character was that kind of moment, and that he didn't want it to happen again. Now that scene, I'm glad you chose that scene, because it shows Owen Roizman's work. It's magnificently beautiful. And Danny Glover, who's a wonderful guy and a great actor. And when I first worked with Danny, which was years earlier in Silverado, he called me up after he really chased the part. He really wanted to be in the movie, and he's irresistible. But when he called me, he said, "I have to tell you, I have this problem remembering lines." And that has continued. It is a challenge for him. He does things beautifully. No one else can do it exactly as he does. It's certainly worth the effort. He's hugely warm and loving person. But this scene is pretty much uncut for 2 or 3 minutes, and it's quite a long speech, and he was absolutely letter perfect.
Fantastic.
And I do love the way he gives that speech. And it really demonstrates something that I've talked about before, which is that you can write these things as best you can, but they don't mean anything until these actors bring them to life. They're just words, or they're black ink on white paper, until these actors get a hold of them. And they do it differently than you ever imagined, and usually better. And they're different emphasis and different phrasing, and you're startled and delighted usually.
It's also a movie that takes a look at the film industry. I mean, there's sort of 2 characters in this film that survive a near-death experience. Kevin's character and a character played by Steve Martin, who's a sort of a Joel Silver type producer of empty action spectacles. And it's interesting to look back on the film now, because this was, at the time, Fox's sort of big Christmas picture of that year. But in a way, it is a movie that seems to anticipate the ground shifting in Hollywood in terms of the kinds of movies that the studios are interested in making. And I'm wondering if you felt that even as you were making the film.
The Steve Martin character, a lot of people feel that he's based on Joel Silver, but in fact, he was based on a friend of mine who was Joel Silver's mentor, a wonderful producer named Larry Gordon, who's from Mississippi.
48 Hours?
Yes, 48 Hours. He's done a lot. He has an incredible list of films that he produced, and among the people who he mentored was Joel Silver, who then went on to have his own empire. But Larry, we've remained friends to this day, and the roughest moment in our relationship was not that he didn't like his portrayal in Grand Canyon, but he wanted to play the part. And when I insisted that I wanted a real actor, Larry, who has a justifiable pride in his own charm and charisma, couldn't understand why I didn't go with him playing himself in this movie. But that character is one of, I feel, enormous affection for, because he is not a bad guy.
No.
He's in a business, and he's doing those things that make money. What happens, as you say, is he has a near-death experience, and for a period of time, he swears off that kind of film. He feels that he's adding to the violence in the world and all the bad things that are going on, and he's going to make a different kind of movie. But he gets over it very quickly, and he goes back to that, and I want to watch my language, but Kevin Kline character does say to him, what happened with that? And he says, oh, what, that? Oh, fuck that. And that was sort of, he just couldn't hang on to it, and he reverted to being his true self. In fact, he quotes from Sullivan's Travels, but gets it all wrong, really, what Sullivan's Travels is about. But in his mind, that's the answer, and he says to Kevin, and it's that your problem is you haven't seen enough movies, because all life's riddles
are answered
in the movies. And I don't think that all of life's riddles are answered in the movies, but a lot are.
Before we turn it over to the audience, I want to talk about a film of yours that's showing in this series, which I think is even more underrated film than I Love You to Death, which is Wyatt Earp, which I think is certainly in terms of the physical production, the most ambitious film of your career, and in some respects narratively also, because it's a very complex story, in a way a kind of a Western version of the Godfather saga with competing families and very dark and complex characters. I think one of the reasons maybe that the film wasn't so popular at the time is that the reading of Wyatt Earp in the film is really of a man who's kind of died inside because of this loss he suffered early on in his life, the love of his life. And he's a tough character to warm up to, and yet you I think, you come away with an incredible understanding of him, and it's actually a very underrated performance of Kevin Costner's. I want to know a little bit about how the project came about, but also about your affinity for the West, because obviously there was Silverado before this. Grand Canyon is an urban film that ends in the West, and Darling Companion is an intimate character film that's set amidst the great mountains of Colorado.
Yes. I had seen, as I say, I grew up in West Virginia, which is where the mountains are mini versions of the great mountains of the West. The Allegheny, the Appalachians are very beautiful. Beautiful country that doesn't have the majesty. In fact, it was always a sore point for me that Michael Cimino, when he made Deer Hunter, which is set in Weirton, right where I grew up, which is just north of Wheeling, when they go out deer hunting, he thought the Appalachians, where the whole story was rooted and supposed to be, and about the immigrant steel workers there, he was disappointed in the Appalachians, and he went out to the Olympics and shot it in Washington State. And I loved the Deer Hunter,
Yeah, me too.
and I love that sequence. But I always wondered about that one particular thing. It bothered me a little bit. When I was actually exposed to it, when I was very young, we were coming back from California, and we took the Santa Fe Super Chief, and that was the first time I had ever seen the Rocky Mountains, and I was mesmerized and enthralled, and there hasn't been a moment since when I haven't been anxious to go back to that setting. I love it. I love the West. I love the desert. I love New Mexico and Arizona. And I see that landscape and my heart fills up and I get excited. And I've tried to place as many stories there as I could. Wyatt Earp gave me an opportunity to tell a very big story, as you say, and a lot of variety of terrain. Westerns are irresistible to me. You can tell any kind of story you want in a Western. It's about figures moving across this magnificent landscape and making up the rules of their lives, which we do to this day. But it was very clear back then when it was an untamed territory and civilization was pushing out into it. The rules were being made up about who would be in charge, what laws would be obeyed, which ones would be ignored, who you couldn't always tell on which side of that line the people were going to fall. It was a dangerous place, and it took, as it does now, very brave men to enforce the law. Wyatt Earp is a 3-hour movie, too long, I think, about a guy who goes from being idealistic and full of hope and, as you say, dying inside. He never gets over a tragedy, and he becomes more and more set in his ideas of right and wrong, which is always a road to tragedy. Maddie Walker in Body Heat has a certain path that she wants to follow, and she does relentlessly, but it doesn't work out well for her either. In the end, she's finally unsatisfied. It's very hard when we set our mind, the very thing that it takes for us to achieve goals, which is a relentless kind of persistence and single-mindedness, can often be our undoing. And with Wyatt Earp, there was a character who became very rigid, and it was his undoing, and it brought upon him enormous sadness and tragedy. It is not the makings of a popular film. In the best of cases, a 3-hour movie about that guy would be a challenge. It was not the best of cases. Another film, very entertaining, a sort of pulpy version of the story, came out
Tombstone.
3 months earlier. It was nothing wrong with it at all. It was fun. Wyatt Earp is not fun. It's a trudge and a sludge, and it's hard work. And another thing happened, and this happens with movies all the time. It's not, it's a chance of timing. Kevin Costner, who I had been very instrumental in his early career, and he became a star. had made Dances with Wolves. And it was very well received, and he won an Academy Award for directing it, and there was an enormous backlash after he won it, and led by Pauline Kael, who I had also mixed kind of relationship with. And she said, this is ridiculous, and this is crap, and that became the second wave of feeling about Dances with Wolves, when in fact Dances with Wolves is an amazing movie, and if you look at it today, it holds up really well, and it has wonderful things in it. But the idea, there was a feeling in the critical community that this guy, this handsome movie star, had somehow gotten away with this scam.
Yeah.
And so here he comes along with another 3-hour Western, except now the guy is really despicable, the hero, which Kevin played beautifully, I thought, and without vanity and sort of clear-eyed, honesty. And there was no way they were going to like that movie. And I'm very pleased that you bring it up. I'm very proud of that movie. When it came out, and a lot of people said this is crap, it was very difficult pill for me to swallow. Not like your usual flop, and I've had the usual flop, run-of-the-mill flop, that's nothing. This was a movie that I really loved. And everybody around me had done great work. Yeah. The costumes, the cinematography by Owen Roizman, editing, the music, James Newton Howard's score is one of the greatest Western scores ever. Everybody had done their job, except I felt that I had not written it exactly right, and I hadn't cut it right, and I hadn't been rigorous with myself about how long it should be. And so it may never have been well received, but I had conspired with its detractors to make it hard to accept. And I felt bad about that, and that was a bad moment for me, not so much career-wise as this thing which is unspoken, we haven't talked about it really, which is part of the challenge of having a long career and making movies. And everybody wants to make movies out there, and it is a challenge to get the money. You're competing for limited resources. But the challenge for someone who writes and directs movies is to keep your spirits up and to keep your confidence up. Because there's not a day that you go out there when you don't think, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a complete sham, and I'm going to be found out today. And so when later people say he's a complete sham and we found him out, you're not shocked. You're like, you're validated. At least you're smart about that thing, which is that you were faking it all along. On the other hand, there are moments in the day when you feel, because movie directing does this to you, when you have all these wonderful people around you doing everything you ask them to do, and it's looking beautiful, and the costumes are great, and we've built the town, and it looks great, and you feel a little godlike. And so at 3:30, you're feeling like a god. At 5:30, you're feeling like a total fake. And that whiplash is hard to take and to maintain over 30 years. So when a movie comes out and people say, this isn't any good, you're not all that shocked, usually. You say, oh, I was afraid of that.
Well, nothing to be afraid of here. One of the most iconic encounters in Western lore, the first meeting of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday.
I'm looking for Dave Rudabaugh. There's a reward for information about him if it leads to his arrest.
Are you a lawman, Wyatt Earp? You are not wearing a badge. Are you ashamed of your profession? I myself was a dentist. I was proud to be a dentist. I did not hide the fact that I was a dentist. How are your teeth, Wyatt Earp?
They're working all right, I guess.
I'll take good care of them. They cannot be replaced.
I think at this point we'll take some questions from the audience for Lawrence Kasdan.
I'd love to ask you about the deleted scene with Kevin Costner in The Big Chill, but instead, you denied that Joel Silver was the model in the Grand Canyon, except you put him in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and Joel Silver is notoriously a Frank Lloyd Wright fan. Did you know that, or was there any intent in that?
There's no connection. I loved that house, and I thought that this producer should have great taste and passionate hobbies and interests.
Which of your skills as a screenwriter were most useful as a director, and what did you learn as a director that made you a better screenwriter?
You find when you start to direct that you need less writing, that you need less scenes, that the actors do a lot of the work, that the cutting does a lot of the work, that eventually music will help convey your feelings about things. And you tend, even to this day, I overwrite, and maybe that's just part of the process. But directing is much more fun. I discovered that right away, which I had always suspected. You're surrounded by wonderful people helping you achieve your goals. Writing, you're all alone. You're looking at a page, and if you're lucky enough to collaborate, as Meg and I did on Darling Companion, it's much relief, but it's still much harder work than going out where 50 people are waiting to help you solve your problems. So I think write less, I learned that, and then I can't do it.
You've mentioned your wife as a partner in your writing, which I think is probably fairly unusual. I'm guessing that you would, obviously do nothing but sing her praises, but that sounds like a very unusual partnership that clearly has lasted decades. A few words about that?
Yeah, it is I was very lucky when I met her. We got along. We've continued to get along for 40 years. She's been involved in the movies that she hasn't written. She's always been the first reader. She's a great critic. She has a good sense of things. When we actually started writing together with Grand Canyon, it was very satisfying. People ask us, how do you work with your wife? Does it cause problems? How do you resolve issues? We've been resolving much more important issues outside of the writing room for 40 years, so it didn't seem that challenging to do something we both liked and we were both interested in, and has its immediate pleasures at times and has its long-term frustrations, and it's a partnership, just like trying to raise kids and doing, muddling through with that.
I noticed in a lot of what you were talking about tonight, and in a lot of your films, you talk about sort of that moment in the human condition where people sort of stick versus go by a river. And you mentioned that too, about hiring the crew and the people around you become family. I'm wondering if you can just sort of talk a little bit about what makes people stick for you and how that gets portrayed on film.
I don't know what it is any more than I know why I liked my wife when I met her. It's mysterious. You meet a lot of people, and there probably were several million other people I might have married too. I found her. I felt lucky. It felt good all these years. I don't know, what is that magic thing? And that is what I'm trying to figure out. I have no answers whatsoever. There's some sort of pie chart that happens with friends, I think, where you admire, their honesty in this degree and their humor in that degree and their loyalty in another thing, and it may be varying slices of the pie. But when you look at that pie, you say, this is a keeper, this is someone I want to be around the rest of it, I want to keep track of for the rest of my life. And it is kind of mysterious and wonderful. In our new movie, we try to deal a little bit with why that happens with a dog. Why does some dog speak to you and others you just like them because you like dogs? But some dogs just come up to you and you're in love. And I don't know why that happens. I know with crew, it's the people that are wonderful at their job and don't look for excuses and don't blame anybody else and don't give you a hard time when you get there and you're barely awake. And they know what you're going for and they're there to help you. And they have enormous pride in what they do, and they don't let anyone run roughshod over them, and I'm attracted to those kind of people.
Could you talk a little bit about your work with actors and coming from the writing desk to the director's chair? Were there frustrations? Were there problems? And how did you approach the whole notion of directing actors?
I wanted to be an actor, and I acted in high school, and I tried to act beyond that, and there was a unanimity that I should not do it. Everyone agreed. And so I decided to, and people told me, you know, you'll never be an actor. And I listened to them, which was the first indication that I should quit, because if you are passionate enough, you ignore all criticism. People did tell me that I should give up writing and that I should forget about directing, and I ignored those people. It didn't occur to me to quit. But with acting, when people said you're no good, I listened to them and I thought maybe they were so right, and that I should direct actors. And I love them, and I admire them the way I admire athletes. They do something I can't do, or musicians. They know some mysterious language that I do not know. And the challenge of directing them, which I loved and love to this day, is finding a language that they understand that communicates what you want, because they're capable of doing anything I want. And they may do it in a different way than I originally conceived, but they will get, if they have made it into the movie, and there are so many actors and so few good parts, but if they're the ones I've chosen to do it, I know that they're capable of doing anything that I need. The problem is for me to communicate what it is at that moment in that movie I need from them. And that is very stimulating work. So it's like being the coach of a fabulous team. And when you call a timeout and everyone gathers around you, if you've ever watched the NBA, you know that everyone towers over the coach. And he's this little guy in the middle saying, you do this and you do that, and praying that they'll do it better than he has figured it out. And that's exactly what it's like to direct a movie. You're surrounded by giants and their talent, and you're telling them what to do, and you're hoping that they interpret it much more, with more quality than you can convey to them at that moment.
How do you feel differently about movies that you have written and directed, as opposed to movies that you have only written, where you're collaborating more with someone else?
I've had very good relationships with the writer Adam Brooks, who wrote French Kiss, and John Kosmeyer, who wrote I Love You to Death. I'm trying to think, Frank Galati, who did the first draft of Accidental Tourist. I've had really good relationships with those people. There's no question that there is something about doing the writing and then going on to direct it that gives you some feeling of ownership and investment that you do not get the other way. I haven't been able to do. Now, wonderful directors often have not written any of their scripts, and they own their movies, and I hope that I own the ones that other people have written, but there is no question that my investment is greater in the ones that just came out of here and went all the way to the screen.
And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about, they say that the editing post-production process is where the third time is when the movie is actually made. Did you find that you had to have some major changes in some of those different films, or were they pretty much the way that you had envisioned in working with your editors?
No, they're always different, and the editing is the final rewrite of the movie. You write it once, and then you bring in all your collaborators, and that's the production. Your primary relationship during the production is with the cameraman and the actors too. But when you're done, everyone goes away, and all the hubbub and some of the pressure goes away, and you get a chance to rethink the whole thing. If you have a great editor, you can do amazing things with a finished film. You're not married to that many things. It's an incredibly plastic art form, and so you get a final chance to rethink the thing. And that's when you really are making the big decisions, and it's sometimes very stressful, and you very often will feel one thing on Tuesday and another thing on Thursday, and the next Monday you're back to where you were. And you think, how could I feel so strongly on each different way of cutting it. But that is the process, and it's a rigorous kind of a vigorous activity, really. It's like working out every day. At the end of a day of editing, you're wrung out. It's just as tiring as making the film, because now you're marrying yourself to, this is really the film. This is not my idea of it. This is not some abstract. This is not the plans for a house. This is the house. And if I put this brick here and commit to it, then it will always be there. And the door will always be in this place in the room. While up to that moment, it could have been anywhere, and you could have cut it in such a way that you always thought the door was on the other side of the room. And you do that in a million different ways over the course of cutting the movie. And you can make enormous improvements, or you can hurt your own movie. You can lose faith in it. You can get tired of it. You get used to something. It's the same way a marriage. In Darling Companion, there's a marriage, long-term marriage, and they've just gotten a little tired of paying attention to each other. And that takes its toll. But they find each other again over the course of the story. That often happens when you're having a relationship with a movie. You could lose your way, you can wander off, and sometimes you never get back. You become convinced that, oh, this is it, this is what I've been searching for. Now we're set, let's lock it, let's score it, let's release it. And as soon as it's released, you think, oh my God, I screwed that up.
You've had such a wonderful variety of films. Is there any genre that you have not been able to start working with that you really have always wanted to work with?
As much as I've enjoyed going from genre to genre, I don't normally think of it that way. I like making movies, and they all surprise me, and you think you know what it's going to be like, and it's never like that. I don't think so. I botched a big effects movie that I probably shouldn't have made in the first place, so I don't even think I should do one of those. I'm not sure I'm capable of doing them, and yet I like certain kinds of effects. I've been very lucky I've gotten to do. There's a certain kind of action movie, there's a certain kind of thriller that I would like to do that I haven't done. I'm working on something now. Harlan Coben, who's a wonderful writer of thriller novels, his new book, and he and I are collaborating on that, and it has some affinity to Body Heat, but it's actually a different kind of movie. It's much more like a Hitchcock film, and it's very dark. It's set in Atlantic City and the suburbs around New York City. And I feel it will be different than anything I've done, and I hope to do that next.
I wonder if you worked with Kevin Kline and William Hurt so much. There's a couple of things I wonder. One of them is, did the way you direct them have to change from movie to movie? And I have a particular thing about I Love You to Death, where I wonder how much their extraordinary performances you saw beforehand, and how much came from Kevin Kline and William Hurt, because they are absolutely hilarious in that movie, and I just wondered how the hell you got them to do that, or whether they just did it.
They do it. I knew that I wanted wonderful people, and as you mentioned them, and River, who was a great privilege to work with River, and he was tragically lost very soon after that. He was like Quicksilver. You didn't know what to do with him exactly, and yet he was so alive, and it was a pleasure to work with. Keanu was very funny in that movie. You get great people who you think great things can happen with, which is part of the challenge of all filmmaking, is trying to create a situation in which something good can happen. And the thing that does happen may be a surprise to you, may be an accident, it may be an unpredictable collision of images that you had never anticipated that suddenly speak volumes in the film. So by stocking your group with wonderfully talented people, you're increasing the odds that something wonderful might happen.
I just wanted to ask one thing in closing, which is that we think a lot about people who start out in independent films, moving in to then direct bigger studio films like
Yeah.
Steven Soderbergh and Christopher Nolan and Bryan Singer. And you and I have talked a little bit in the last couple of days that now you sort of have an interesting migration of people who worked for many years in the studio system
Yes.
doing independent films like Darling Companion. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you to do a film that I imagine was made for, a sort of like a day's catering budget on Wyatt Earp.
There's no question. It was made for very little money and very short amount of time. The people who came and joined us to make that movie did so not for monetary reasons, obviously. So you get this wonderful commitment to the project itself. Now, the truth is that's been true on these big, expensive movies, too, where people have come and joined you in this effort. With independent films, small films, low budget, short schedules, there's no question that there's nothing except the commitment to the project, and that's kind of wonderful. I think the reason we're seeing a lot of people do that is because Hollywood is not interested in such a huge range of films. They've narrowed the kinds of films that they're willing to make to a very small number of genres, types, spectacular kind of roadshowy, as we used to call them, movies. And that they've sort of shied away, not sort of, they actually, in Hollywood, there was an amazing moment about 8 years ago when the people at Universal, and they're not any worse than any other studio, started referring to drama as the D word, and that they were going to avoid the D word. So if you are going to avoid drama, that lets out a lot of stories. And they just felt that that was not a profitable form to work in, that they were in a different business than that. I was very lucky that for 20 years, 25 years, studios didn't feel that way. But now it's very unusual, excuse me, for a studio to make anything that resembles those kind of movies that I loved and grew up with from the 40s all the way through to the 80s. And so you're going to finding people like Works here from Minneapolis who funded this movie when other people would not. When we never even took it to a studio. There was no way we thought that Darling Companion could be made by a studio now, because it's not so extreme, the jokes are not so gross. It tries to be about the little things that are true about human nature. That is not of interest to the Hollywood studio. So their great films can be made in Hollywood, and their great films can be made outside of the system. Not being cheap and being made under difficult circumstances does not ensure quality or interest or anything. It doesn't make you righteous or better. It just means that you found a way, which has never changed. How do you find that narrow corridor of daylight that you can get your movie made? And so you're finding, well, what will the market bear? Who will give you enough money to get this thing done? And then who will join you in that process? People like Kevin Kline and Diane Wiest and Richard Jenkins, who would come out, and Diane Keaton, and not demand a trailer and not demand time or not demand another take, but say, I'm willing to take this vigorous, this really fast ride with you at a low price because I like this material. So you're going to find those kind of collaborators. It's just like meeting someone that you don't, all of a sudden you have a new friend. And that's what it is to gather the people to make a movie like that.
Lawrence Kasdan, it's been such an enormous pleasure to spend a couple of hours up here with you tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
That was great. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you.